Welcome to day 18 of our scripture reading and encouragement. Today we're going to cover Genesis chapter 46, 47, and 48. And we're going to finish up Matthew 15, covering verses 21 through 39. So as we pick up in Genesis, Jacob is taking his family and they're setting out for Egypt. And along the way, God speaks to Jacob in a vision. And he gives him peace. He gives him assurance that he's going to be safe going to Egypt. And that's where his family is going to grow into a great nation. And essentially, he's reaffirming the promise that he's already made to Abraham and Isaac. He's assuring Jacob, you're going to see your son. So Jacob finally gets to see Joseph after 22 plus years. Can you imagine the excitement and the emotion that he would have, or the two of them would have, being reunited? And it says Pharaoh welcomes them. And it's an interesting thing. It's been pointed out a couple of times by Joseph. Egyptians despise shepherds. And all of Jacob's family, they're all shepherds. So despite that, Pharaoh welcomes them because he appreciates what Joseph has done. He appreciates and understands that God has used Joseph to bless that nation. You know, Joseph not only interpreted the dreams and helped set up Pharaoh for success in the 7 years of famine, but he has acquired all the money, all the livestock, all the property. So Pharaoh, during a tough time, has really flourished, and Pharaoh appreciates that. And it's interesting to see that, because we always talk about the Pharaoh that with the plagues and everything with Moses, and that's coming up soon. But this is a Pharaoh that was appreciative of what God was using Joseph to do, and he rewarded Joseph's family, Jacob and his family, with the best land in Egypt. So it's interesting to see as we go through the scripture over the next couple of weeks that we're going to see a very drastically different Pharaoh as it relates to Moses coming up in the future. But it says Jacob lived for 17 more years in Egypt. So he got back some of that time he had missed with his son. And I think that's just an incredible story. Then we transition over into Matthew, and we see this Gentile woman, and she's coming up to Jesus, and her daughter is possessed by a demon, and she's begging Jesus to heal her daughter, and Jesus ignores her. The disciples are trying to turn her away. And that may seem harsh, but they give us the answer. Remember, we have to keep keep in our memory that Jesus came for God's chosen people, the Israelites, the Jews. It wasn't until they rejected him that the Gentiles were able to get Jesus. So at this time, the Jews had not rejected Jesus. So this Gentile woman wouldn't have been worthy of Jesus, so to speak. But her persistence, her faith, when she stayed persistent in her asking, it showed her faith, and Jesus honored that and healed her. And he says something, he gives the analogy, and he says, it isn't right to take food from the children and throw it to the dogs. And that seems like such a harsh analogy of, man, he's comparing the people of Israel as children to the Gentiles, which would include us, to dogs. And that seems like a harsh analogy. But if you look into the true Hebrew, or into the Greek translation, when it says throw it to the dogs, it would be more appropriately translated to cute little puppy. So he wasn't being quite as harsh as it looked, but we need to remember to be thankful. I know it sounds crazy to say this, but to be thankful that the Jews rejected Jesus, because without them rejecting Jesus, we didn't get Jesus. But what's the point? The point is to be persistent in your faith. Be persistent in your faith, and Jesus will honor that. Then Jesus is in front of a vast crowd, and it says he healed them all. All these people came to him that were lame, that were blind, crippled. They couldn't speak, many others, and he healed them all. And then we find ourselves in the same situation where he's got this vast crowd out in the wilderness and there's no food. Now, I want to remind you, it was just one chapter earlier that Jesus fed 5,000 men, which would have been thousands of people, maybe 20, 30,000 people. He took very little and fed them. Now we find ourselves a chapter later in a very similar scenario, and the disciples are going, how are we going to feed these people? And I'm like, come on, man. You were just with him. You've seen him do all these miracles. You've seen him produce food for the 5,000. And now you're questioning how he's going to produce food for these people. But then I'm reminded, how many people in today's world, how many times for us does God do something miraculous in our lives? Does he answer a prayer? And we find ourselves sometime later in a similar scenario, asking for his help, doubting that he'll be able to do it again. So we can't be too harsh on how we treat the disciples here. It's just a reminder that we have to have our faith renewed every day. So it says in verse 33, The disciples ask, where will we get enough food here in the wilderness for such a huge crowd? And Jesus says, how much do we have? We got 7 loaves and a few small fish, and Jesus blesses it, and they feed them again. They feed thousands of people. So the encouragement that I want you to get out of today is that we need to be persistent like the Gentile woman. We need to be persistent in our prayers. We need to be persistent in our faith, and God will honor that. And we need to remember when we are asking God for something, we have a tough spot in our life and we're asking God for something, we need to remember the times He has honored and answered our prayers before, and use that as motivation to continue to be persistent. If God answered our prayer a month ago, a year ago, 5 years ago, why would we not have faith that He would do it again? I hope you're encouraged today, and I hope you have a great day.